Before the magistrate could lift his gavel, a woman in the back row gagged into her shawl. The air in that cramped courtroom was thick with a sweetness that did not belong to any bloom in creation, a syrup of rot and longing that slithered past the nose and straight into the gut. Constable Briggs stood rigid in the witness box, his face the colour of old dough, holding a square of muslin at arm's length as if it were a live adder. Every man and woman packed into the pews behind him, the very same folk who had stoned Alice Godwin's door not 3 nights past, pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths. They had come to see a witch exposed, but the scent seeping from that rag was making the hardest among them weep for no reason they could name. The magistrate barked for the windows to be thrown open, though the December fog outside was yellow with smut from the mill chimneys. Tanner's Row sat in the belly of a Lancashire mill town, a street of cramped back-to-backs where the stink of curing hides warred daily with the reek of coal smoke and privy pits. They were practical people. They had no stomach for mystery. Alice Godwin, the woman accused, stood in the dock wearing a black bombazine gown that had been turned at the cuffs 3 times over. Her hair, a nest of iron grey, was scraped back from a face lined not with malice but with a fatigue so deep it had become a kind of stillness. Her hands resting on the rail were the hands of a woman who had pulled more nettles than loaves of bread. The knuckles were swollen, the skin engraved with fine cracks like old clay. Briggs cleared his throat and began his testimony, urged on by sharp looks from the front row where Ida Fletcher sat with her arms folded. Ida, a washerwoman with a tongue that could strip paint, had been the first to bang on the constable's door at midnight 2 weeks ago. She claimed a ghost was at work in the withering patch of dirt behind Alice Godwin's cottage. The garden had died 4 years ago. Everyone knew that. The day they hauled William Godwin out of the weaving shed, his ribcage crushed by a loose fly shuttle, was the day the first rosebush dropped its petals. By the end of that summer, the hollyhocks had blackened at the stalks, the lavender had twisted into grey knots, and the earth had taken on a hard, cracked glaze, as if the ground itself had gone into mourning. Nobody doubted it. Grief had poisoned the soil. It was a miserable but ordinary thing. But Ida swore on her mother's grave that at the witching hour a smell rose from that dead ground that could not be of this world. Briggs had dismissed her at first. Tanner's Row was a place where women saw omens in spilt salt. Yet the reports spread. 3 separate mill hands, sober men, who had never read a book in their lives, stopped him in the street to say they had caught a whiff of something passing Alice's gate that had stopped them dead. Joe Harling, a carter with a face like a slab of ham, said it was the exact smell of the bread his mother baked before the cholera took her. Elsie Patchett, who worked a loom 14 hours a day, said it was the scent of the riverbank where she had walked with her first sweetheart, a lad lost in the Boer War. The constable had no time for sentiment, but when 6 rate-paying citizens demanded he search the premises, he complied. He found nothing damning, just a small copper pot, an alembic of the sort old women used for herbal remedies, simmering on a clean stove. The kitchen was orderly, scrubbed. Alice had not resisted. She had merely stood aside, her thin mouth settled into a line of quiet waiting. Briggs, feeling foolish, was about to leave when he spotted a small glass phial on the mantelpiece, stoppered with a cork. It contained a liquid the colour of weak tea. He pulled the cork, dabbed a little onto the rag he used to clean his pipe, and then he smelled it. His report, read aloud in court, stated that he felt as if the top of his skull had been lifted off. He could not describe the scent. It was not floral. It was not edible. It was the smell of a wet garden in the hour before dawn. The smell of memory itself, distilled. That muslin rag now passed from the magistrate's clerk to the bench. The magistrate, a man named Hargreaves who prided himself on his jurisdiction over nothing more mystical than public drunkenness and small thefts, flinched. His nostrils flared. For a full 3 seconds he was no longer in a shabby municipal hall but in a sunlit field he had not seen since boyhood, clutching the warm flank of a horse long dead. He dropped the rag as if burned. A murmur ran through the court. Ida Fletcher rose halfway from her seat. "That is not a Christian odour," she shrilled. "No living plant gives off that air. She has poisoned the soil with her wickedness, and now she bottles the breath of fiends." Alice did not bother to look at Ida. Her gaze was fixed on the rag, and a faint smile stirred the corners of her mouth. It was not a smile of defiance. It was the weary, private smile of a woman who knows the answer to a riddle no one else can read. She knew they were not smelling a fiend's breath. They were smelling the very last essence of her withered garden. the oil of petals that had survived the blight and the frost, rendered down over a low, patient flame into something that cut through the grime of their lives and touched the soft, buried hurt beneath. She had not conjured it with spells. She had learnt it, night after night, from a soiled scrap of paper in her dead son's handwriting. But she would not tell them that. Not yet. The constable demanded she explain the unholy scent. She only tilted her head, her bark-like hands unmoving on the rail, and waited for the room to finish its sobbing. Outside the high windows, the fog pressed against the glass like a blind animal. The gas lamps hissed. And in the dock, Alice Godwin inhaled the last trace of her own making, gathering her silence around her like a cloak, while the magistrate ordered the file and the alembic to be sealed as evidence and the woman held in custody until a full inquiry could be made. The smell of rotten roses clung to the courtroom benches long after the crowd was cleared, a whisper of something broken and beautiful that refused to fade. The summer of 1901 unspooled across Lancashire like a bolt of cheap calico, thin in places, scratchy in others, but lit with a stubborn, dusty brilliance that made the mill workers squint as they trudged home at dusk. William Godwin was 17 that year, a lath of a lad with his mother's deep-set eyes and a habit of walking the long way home from the weaving shed to pick wildflowers from the verge. He brought them back wilting in his fist, stems crushed by the weight of his clogs, and planted them in the pocket of earth behind the cottage that Alice had grudgingly conceded to him when he was a boy. She had never seen the point of ornament. A garden, in her mind, was for cabbages and onions and the bitter herbs that kept the winter agues at bay. But William had a tenderness in him that she could not account for, a softness that the mill overseers mistook for weakness and the other lads mistook for something worse. He liked the feel of soil under his nails. He liked watching green things climb toward the sun. That June, he came home carrying a cutting wrapped in damp sacking, a slip of an old country rose he had begged off a carter passing through from Cheshire. The carter had told him it was a moss rose, a variety that had grown in English hedgerows since before the first George sat on the throne, prized not for its petals alone but for the fine, resinous fuzz that grew on its sepals and buds, a mossy exudation that trapped the scent of rain and released it in the evening cool. William planted it against the south-facing wall of the cottage, where the bricks held the day's heat long after the sun dipped behind the mill chimney. Alice watched him from the kitchen window, her hands buried in a basin of grey washing water. She said nothing. She rarely did. But she noticed how carefully he firmed the soil around the roots, how he spoke to the cutting under his breath as if it were a nervous animal. The garden that summer became a small riot of colour, a sliver of defiance wedged between a privy wall and a coal shed. The moss rose took hold and threw out canes thick as a man's thumb. William coaxed hollyhocks from seed, their spires rising taller than his head, pink and cream, and a deep bruised plum. Lavender bordered the path, its grey-green tufts releasing a clean, sharp scent when brushed by a trouser leg. Feverfew and chamomile spread in a froth of white and yellow, and a single honeysuckle threaded itself through the fence pickets, its perfume pooling in the narrow alleyway at dusk. The neighbours thought it a harmless eccentricity. Old Missus. Tibbet, who lived 2 doors down and kept her own yard swept bare as a skull, sniffed that the Godwin boy would grow out of it once he had a wife and a wage to worry over. But Alice saw something else. She saw her son, a quiet, awkward boy who had never quite learned to look people in the eye, become something steady when he stood among his plants. He learned their rhythms, their needs. He knew when to water and when to withhold, when to prune hard and when to let a stem run wild. He called it instinct, but Alice recognised it for what it was. He had inherited her hands, the hands of a woman who had grown up in a village where every ailment had its corresponding leaf or root, where knowledge of the land was not a luxury, but a necessity passed down in a whisper from mother to daughter. She had just never thought to pass it to a son. The mill owned them, as it owned everyone in Tanner's Row. The weaving shed was a cavern of iron and leather belts, the air thick with cotton fly that settled in the lungs and killed men slow. William worked a broad loom near the north windows, where the light was good for catching broken threads, but the draught from the broken panes cut through his jacket in winter. He was not built for it. His shoulders were narrow, his wrists thin. The older weavers, men with forearms like hams and hearing dulled by decades of clatter, ribbed him for his delicate ways. They called him Flower Billy and left dead mice in his clogs. He bore it. He had learnt early that boys who complained got it worse, and he had his garden to come home to, his quiet patch of scent and colour that asked nothing of him but patience. Alice would sometimes find him there after dark, sitting on an upturned bucket, a stub of candle burning on the wall, watching the white blooms of the moss rose glow in the night air. She would call him in, and he would come, but slowly. The accident happened on a Tuesday in late September, a day of thin, metallic light and a wind that rattled the loose panes in the weaving shed. The loom that William worked was a Dobcross machine, an older model that the mill owner, a man named Sutcliffe, had bought second-hand from a mill in Oldham that had upgraded to the new Northrop automatics. The Dobcross was a temperamental beast. Its shuttle mechanism relied on a leather picker that had to be replaced every few weeks, and the warp tension needed constant adjustment. The tackler, a man with a missing thumb and a permanent scowl, had warned Sutcliffe that the timing band on William's loom was fraying. Sutcliffe, who had lost a packet on a shipment of Egyptian cotton that had come through damp, had told the tackler to make it last another month. At 3:15 in the afternoon, the timing band snapped. The fly shuttle, a block of hardwood tipped with steel, shot sideways from its channel at a speed that made the air whistle. It struck William in the left side of his rib cage, 3 inches below the heart. The impact lifted him off his feet. He did not cry out. By the time the nearest weaver reached him, he was already gone. His body crumpled under the warp beam like a discarded rag. The tackler, white-faced, cut the power to the entire shed. A hush fell. Men stood at their stations, their hands still moving in the remembered rhythm of the work, staring at the boy they had mocked and thinking, one by one, that they had never learned his surname until that moment. They carried him home on a plank. Alice heard the tread of boots in the alleyway before the knock came, and she knew. Women of her generation knew the sound of death arriving. She opened the door and saw her son laid out on a length of unsanded deal, his face unmarked, his chest caved inward, and she did not scream. She put her hand on his cheek. It was already cooling. The weavers stood behind him, caps in hands, their shadows long in the gaslight from the street lamp. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say. The mill had eaten another boy, and the mill would eat more, and the town would go on because it had no choice. The garden died by inches in the weeks that followed. Alice did not plant anything new. She did not pull the weeds that crept into the beds. She simply stopped. The autumn rains came and beat the last petals from the moss rose. The lavender turned grey at the tips, then brown, then black. The earth, unaerated and untended, formed a hard crust that cracked in the cold like old porcelain. By Christmas, the garden was a skeleton, a tangle of dead sticks and withered leaves that rattled in the wind. The neighbours nodded sagely. Grief, they said, had poisoned the soil. It was a natural thing, a sad thing, but not a strange thing. They stopped looking over the fence. They stopped thinking about William Godwin and his funny little flowers. Death was too common in that part of town to hold anyone's attention for long. Alice, however, did not stop. She continued to move through the days with the rigid economy of a woman who has no money to waste and no tears left to spend. She took in sewing. She blacked her own stove. And late at night, when the street was quiet except for the distant throb of the night shift at the mill, she sat at her kitchen table and read. She had never been a great reader. Her letters came slow, and the newspaper taxed her. But William had left behind a small stack of books borrowed from a penny library in the town and never returned. One of them caught her eye in the bleak January of 1902, when the cold was so bitter that the ink froze in the bottle. It was a thin, battered volume on the apothecary arts, printed in 1837, its pages foxed and its spine cracked. Inside, someone had scribbled marginalia in a spidery hand, noting which herbs settled the stomach and which poultices drew out inflammation. Alice recognised the handwriting immediately. It was William's. The letters were cramped and careful, the hand of a boy who had taught himself to write neatly in defiance of the mill's grime. Tucked into the chapter on essential oils was a loose sheet of paper, folded twice. She opened it. It was a recipe, or the beginnings of one, written in pencil that had smudged with handling. Catching the ghost of a good thing, William had written at the top, and below it, a list of steps that made no sense to her at first. He described a method of collecting bruised and blighted petals, the ones that had been touched by frost or blight, the ones that had struggled and failed. He wrote that these damaged flowers, when heated gently in a copper vessel, released a substance that healthy blooms did not. He called it the dense oil of survival, a phrase that sounded to Alice's ear like something between poetry and madness. She read the note twice, then a third time. She did not weep, but she folded the paper very carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her apron, and the next morning she walked out into the dead garden and began to pick the blackened, withered buds that still clung to the rose canes, her swollen fingers working with a delicacy that had lain dormant for 4 decades. That first winter was a season of quiet, obsessive failure. Alice worked at the kitchen stove, using a copper kettle she had bought second-hand from a tinker. She did not know the science. She did not know that stressed plants produce secondary metabolites, concentrated aromatic compounds, as a chemical defense. She only knew what her hands learned. The ruined petals, simmered too fast, produced a watery, acrid steam that smelled of boiled cabbage and despair. Distilled too slow, they gave off nothing at all. She burned batch after batch, filling the cottage with strange, bitter odours that drove the neighbours to muttering. Ida Fletcher, the washerwoman from down the street, knocked 3 times to ask if something had died under the floorboards. Alice sent her away with a curt shake of her head. She was not ready. The scent she was chasing was not yet ready either. By spring, she had refined her method. The copper pot now sat on a trivet over a bed of coals that she tended with the vigilance of a mother. The blighted rosebuds, soaked in rainwater for a full day, gave up their essence in a slow, reluctant trickle, a liquid that separated into a pale, aromatic oil and a milky, fragrant water. Alice caught the oil on a spoon and transferred it to a glass phial she had found in William's belongings. When she pulled the cork, the smell that rose was not the smell of flowers. It was the smell of the earth after a long drought, the smell of old wood and distant rain and something else, something she could not name. It was the smell of William's coat, the one she had never washed, folded in a drawer upstairs. It was the smell of the night he had sat on his bucket and watched the white rose glow. She stoppered the phial and hid it behind the loose brick in the chimney breast, and for the first time in months she slept without dreaming of the mill. The spring of 1905 arrived in Tanner's Row like a debt collector, grey and insistent, melting the last of the winter slush into rivulets of filth that ran between the cobbles and pooled in the hollows where the cart wheels had worn the stone. Mr. Phineas Grove stepped off the train at the town station on a Thursday morning in late March, a man so conspicuously out of place that the porter who took his bag stared openly at the cut of his coat. It was a garment of dark, fine wool lined with silk, its lapels sharp enough to cut bread. Grove was not a tall man. He stood 5 feet and 6 inches in his polished brogues, and his frame had the compact, pampered softness of a man who had never lifted anything heavier than a fountain pen. His face was round and clean-shaven, his hair a thinning shade of gingery brown, his eyes a pale, watery blue that missed nothing. He carried a leather valise in one hand and a silver-topped cane in the other, and he walked through the soot and the noise with the careful, mincing tread of a cat crossing a puddle. He was a scent hunter by trade. The term was not yet in common usage, but the great perfume houses of Paris and London had employed men like Grove for decades. They were not chemists, though they knew enough chemistry to hold a conversation. They were not botanists, though they could identify a plant by the shape of its leaf in poor light. They were buyers, scouts, procurers of the raw and the rare. The houses needed rose absolute from Bulgaria, jasmine concrete from Grasse, bergamot from Calabria, sandalwood from Mysore, but the market had shifted in recent years. The fashionable noses of Paris, led by the likes of Coty and Guerlain, had begun to tire of the simple soliflores that had dominated the previous century. They craved complexity, strangeness, notes that evoked not a flower but a feeling. They wanted the smell of decay, of animal warmth, of things that had lived and died. Ambergris, the waxy expulsion of a sperm whale, fetched its weight in gold. Civet paste, scraped from the glands of captive cats in Ethiopia, was traded in locked boxes. Grove's particular genius, if it could be called that, was his ability to smell a compound and know immediately whether it possessed what the houses called sillage, that trailing wake of scent that lingers in a room long after the wearer has departed. He had come to this god-forsaken mill town on the barest whisper of a rumour. A dealer in essential oils named Hawtrey, a man with whom Grove shared a club in St. James's, had mentioned over brandy that one of his travelling agents had passed through Lancashire in February and had been accosted in a public house by a carter who claimed his street was haunted by a phantom perfume. The carter, a man named Joe Harling, had been drunk, but his description had been unnervingly precise. He had spoken of a smell that was not floral, not herbal, not animalic, but something that seemed to bypass the nose entirely and lodge directly in the memory. Grove had heard such descriptions before. They almost always led to a synthetic, some amateur chemist in a basement, mixing coal tar derivatives and calling it alchemy. But occasionally, once in a decade perhaps, they led to something genuine. The prospect of a decade's find was enough to justify a train fare and a night in a damp inn. He took a room at the Black Bull on Mill Street, a coaching inn that had seen better centuries. The landlady, a solid woman with a moustache and a limp, showed him to a chamber above the taproom where the mattress was stuffed with horsehair, and the window looked out onto a brick wall 2 feet away. Grove unpacked his valise, laying out a portable scent organ, a small wooden box containing 24 files of single-note oils and absolutes, his reference library for the field. He dabbed a drop of synthetic jasmine on his wrist to calibrate his nose, freshened his collar, and set out into the streets. Tanner's Row was not hard to find. It was the sort of street that respectable maps omitted, a dogleg of cramped cottages wedged between the canal and the railway embankment, its air thick with the sour reek of the tanning pits and the constant, percussive clatter of the mill. Grove picked his way along the unpaved thoroughfare, his polished brogue squelching in the mud, his handkerchief pressed to his nose. The residents stared at him from doorways and upper windows. A gentleman in Tanner's Row was a sight rarer than a comet. Children stopped their games to gawk. A woman emptying a slop bucket into the gutter paused mid-pour, her eyes narrowing. He had not yet reached Alice Godwin's cottage when the scent stopped him. It was not a waft. It was not a hint. It was a single, solitary molecule that entered his nasal cavity and detonated against his olfactory epithelium with the force of a physical blow. Grove halted so abruptly that his cane skidded on a loose cobble. He stood motionless in the middle of the street, his pale eyes wide, his handkerchief forgotten. The scent was coming from a chimney pot on a cottage 3 doors down, a thin, pale thread of smoke that rose against the grey sky and then dipped, caught by a downdraft, spilling into the alleyway where he stood. He inhaled again, a long, slow professional draw, and his mind, trained to dissect a fragrance into its constituent notes, simply refused. There was no top note. There was no heart. There was no base. There was a single, indivisible presence, and it smelled exactly like the blackberry jam his grandmother had made in a kitchen that no longer existed, in a village that the railways had killed. In a summer before the old queen had died and the world had gone hard and fast, Grove felt, to his utter mortification, a sting of moisture in his eyes. He collected himself with an effort that was almost physical. He adjusted his cuffs. He pressed his handkerchief to his brow. Then he walked to Alice Godwin's door, a plain plank of deal weathered to silver, and knocked 3 times with the silver head of his cane. The woman who opened the door looked nothing like a witch. She looked like a servant, or a factory hand, or any of the 1,000 invisible women who kept the machinery of the empire running. Her gown was clean but worn. Her hands, resting on the doorframe, were a landscape of labour. Her face was closed, watchful, the face of a woman who had learned that strangers rarely brought good news. Grove removed his hat and introduced himself with the practised courtesy of a man who had negotiated with Bedouin chieftains and Provençal peasants alike. He presented his card. He explained that he represented a Parisian house of great repute, that he had been travelling in the district, that he had chanced to pass her cottage and had been struck, positively struck, by an aroma of the most extraordinary quality. Might he inquire as to its provenance? Alice listened without expression. When he finished, she did not invite him in. She said only that she did not know what he was talking about. She had a kettle on the stove, nothing more. Grove smiled his professional smile. He had heard such denials before. Every shepherd in the Bulgarian rose valleys claimed ignorance when the buyers came. He opened his leather valise and produced a small velvet pouch. From the pouch he drew 5 gold sovereigns. He laid them on the windowsill, their milled edges catching the thin spring light. He said that he was prepared to pay handsomely. He said that his employers would pay more. He said that the phial of liquid that had produced that scent was worth more than this house, this street, this entire wretched town. He said all of this in a low, smooth, reasonable voice that had coaxed secrets out of 100 reluctant cultivators. Alice looked at the sovereigns. She looked at the card. Then she looked at Grove, with an expression that he could not read. She said that she had nothing to sell. She stepped back and closed the door, and Grove heard the bolt slide into place with a finality that brooked no argument. He stood on the doorstep for a long moment, his pale eyes thoughtful. He picked up his sovereigns, returned them to his pouch, and walked back toward the Black Bull with his mind working furiously. A woman who refused 5 gold sovereigns was either mad, or she knew precisely what she held. Ida Fletcher had been watching the entire exchange from her doorstep 3 cottages down. Her arms were wet to the elbows from the washtub, and her hair was escaping its pins in damp, greying strands. She had seen the gentleman in the fine coat. She had seen the sovereigns. She had seen the door shut in the gentleman's face. Ida was not a clever woman, but she was a hungry one. Her husband had died of a burst appendix 5 years previous, and she had been left with nothing but his debts and a weakening grip in her right hand that made the laundry work an agony. She had watched Alice Godwin for years with a simmering resentment that had no clear cause. Alice kept to herself. Alice asked for nothing. Alice did not drink, did not gossip, did not scold her neighbours' children. Her very self-containment was an affront, an unspoken judgment on those who could not manage their own affairs. Now this gentleman had come, offering gold, and Alice had refused him. Ida felt the gears of her mind grind into motion. There was wealth in that dead garden. There was wealth in that little cottage with its chimney smoke that smelled of memory and heartache. And if Alice Godwin would not take the gentleman's money, then perhaps the gentleman needed to be made aware of certain facts. Facts about the unnatural goings-on. Facts about the phantom smells that woke honest folk from their sleep. Facts about a woman who had poisoned the soil with her grief and was now bottling the poison for profit. Ida dried her hands on her apron and began to plan. That evening she made a circuit of the street. She visited Elsie Patchett, who worked the same loom William Godwin had died on, and reminded her of the smell that had drifted through her window on 3 separate nights, a smell that had given her dreams of her lost sweetheart so vivid she woke weeping. She visited Joe Harling, the carter, and poured him a cup of gin, and listened while he repeated the story of the bread his mother had baked. She visited the widow Tibbet and nodded sympathetically while the old woman complained that the smell gave her palpitations. To each of them, Ida planted the same seed. Alice Godwin was hoarding something valuable. The London gentleman with the gold sovereigns had been turned away because Alice wanted more. She was holding out while honest folk scraped by on pennies. She was using unnatural means to brew her perfume, means that had poisoned the garden and might yet poison the air they all breathed. Was it not suspicious, Ida asked, that the garden had died exactly when the boy had died? Was it not strange that the perfume smelled of the dead? Who had ever heard of a perfume that smelled of a dead boy's coat? By the end of the week, the seed had taken root. The street, which had merely muttered before, began to murmur. A stone was thrown at Alice's window in the dead of night. A dead rat appeared on her doorstep. Children, coached by their mothers, drew back when she passed. Ida, watching from her doorway, felt a dark, warm satisfaction. The gentleman would come back. She would make sure of it. And when he did, she would be there to demand her share of whatever treasure lay hidden in the withered garden. The mob came on a night when the moon was a thin paring of bone, and the wind drove the smell of the tannery pits down through the alleyways like a slop cart tipping its load. Ida Fletcher had spent the afternoon at the Black Bull, spending money she did not have on gin she should not have drunk, bending the ear of anyone who would listen. She had refined her story over the weeks of waiting. It was no longer a vague accusation of unnatural odours. It was a polished narrative, honed on the whetstone of her own resentment, and she delivered it now with the conviction of a woman who had been wronged personally by Alice Godwin's refusal to share her fortune. The perfume, she told the men gathered in the taproom, was made from the grave dirt of the boy. That was why the garden had died. That was why the smell made grown men weep. Alice had dug up her own son's bones and boiled them in her copper pot, and now a London gentleman was going to pay her a king's ransom for the unholy essence. She would leave them all behind, Ida said. Leave them to rot in their poverty while she lived like a lady on the proceeds of her witchcraft. The men in the taproom were not thinkers. They were mill hands and carters and bricklayers, their bodies worn down by labour, their minds softened by cheap spirits. They heard Ida's story, and they believed it, because belief was easier than inquiry, and because a woman who kept to herself and refused gold sovereigns was already guilty of something in their eyes. By 10 o'clock, a group of 8 men and 3 women, Ida at their head like a ragged general, had gathered in the alley behind the Godwin cottage. They carried a motley assortment of makeshift weapons. Joe Harling had brought a pick handle. The widow Tibbet's grown son, a sullen slab of a man named Walter, had an iron bar he used for shifting frozen coal. The women had stones and broken bricks. They were not drunk enough to be blind, but they were drunk enough to be brave, and they had spent enough weeks marinating in Ida's poison that they had convinced themselves this was justice. The first stone hit the kitchen window while Alice was measuring tea leaves into a cracked pot. The sound of shattering glass is a particular thing, a violent, crystalline music that stops the heart for a beat before the brain can make sense of it. Alice did not scream. She did not run. She set down the tin of tea with a hand that trembled only slightly, walked to the door, and stepped out into her yard. The mob fell silent for a moment when they saw her. They had expected a hag, a crone, something monstrous that fit the story they had built. They saw instead a woman of 62 years, her hair pinned tight, her black gown patched at the elbows, her face a mask of quiet, exhausted fury. She did not plead. She did not curse. She stood in the doorway of her cottage, the shattered glass glittering on the flags behind her, and she looked at them. It was the silence that unmanned them. A mob needs resistance, needs screaming and pleading and the hot, wet drama of fear. Alice gave them none of it. She just stood there, her bark-like hands folded in front of her, and waited. Ida, sensing the momentum slipping, let out a shriek about the grave dirt and the bones and the gold that was hidden inside. She picked up a stone and hurled it herself. It missed Alice, struck the doorframe, and ricocheted into the darkness. But the spell was broken. The mob surged forward. Walter Tibbet wrenched the garden gate from its hinges with a single heave of his shoulders. The pickets splintered like matchwood. Men poured into the withered garden, their boots sinking into the hard, cracked soil, their weapons swinging at anything that stood. The dead rose canes snapped underfoot. The twisted grey remnants of the lavender were ground into the dirt. Joe Harling, in a fit of righteous destruction, brought his pick handle down on the cold frame where Alice had been nursing a handful of winter cuttings. The glass shattered inward, the wooden frame collapsed, and the tender green shoots that had been reaching toward the thin spring light were pulped into the mud. Alice did not move. She stood in the doorway, her eyes tracking the destruction with a terrible, dry precision. She marked which faces were which. She marked who swung and who hung back. She marked Walter Tibbet's iron bar and Joe Harling's pick handle, and the three women who had come to watch the sport. She was not a fool. She knew that a woman of her age and size could not fight 8 grown men, but she could remember. And she did remember, with a clarity that would prove useful. The copper pot. The words came to her unbidden, a cold, sharp thought that cut through the noise. She had left the alembic on the stove, still warm from the afternoon's work, a fresh batch of oil cooling in its glass phial on the mantelpiece. If they found it, they would smash it. Years of labour, years of grief transmuted into something tangible, would be splashed across the floorboards and lost. She turned and went back inside, not running, not panicking, moving with the deliberate economy of a woman conserving her energy for a longer fight. She reached the kitchen just as a brick sailed through the front window and shattered against the opposite wall. The phial was on the mantelpiece, its pale amber contents glowing in the light of the single candle. She snatched it, wrapped it in a handkerchief and pressed it into the pocket of her gown. Then she lifted the copper pot from the stove. Still warm, still smelling of the last distillation, and she held it against her chest like an infant. The kitchen door burst inward. Walter Tibbet filled the frame, his iron bar raised, his face a blank mask of destruction. Behind him, Ida Fletcher craned her neck to see the treasure she was certain was hidden. Alice did not speak. She did not have to. The copper pot was the only thing of value in the room, the only thing that gleamed in the candlelight, and Walter seized it as if it were a chest of gold. He wrenched it from Alice's hands. The metal, still hot from the stove, seared his palms, and he dropped it with a yelp. The pot clanged against the stone flags, its lid flying off, and the last few drops of the day's batch, a thin, amber liquid that smelled of rain on dead leaves, and the faint, distant memory of roses, spilled across the floor. Alice knelt. She did not weep. She gathered the pot, and she stood again, and she faced Walter Tibbet with an expression that made him step back. It was not rage. It was not fear. It was the look of a woman who had already lost everything she could lose, who had nothing left to protect but a pot and a phial and the ghost of a boy who had loved his roses, and who would not be moved. The moment broke when a voice cut through the chaos from the alleyway. It was not a shout, it was a calm, clipped, educated voice. The voice of a man accustomed to giving orders in drawing rooms and having them obeyed in jungles. "Put that iron down," said Phineas Grove, stepping through the shattered gate with his silver-topped cane tapping on the ruined flagstones, "or I shall be obliged to fetch the constable, and you shall all spend the night in a cell that makes this charming street look like the Ritz." The mob froze. They were not afraid of the constable, who was a local man and could be reasoned with. They were afraid of the gentleman. His coat alone was worth more than their annual wages. His accent placed him in a world of magistrates and laws and punishments that could not be bribed away with a pint of ale. He was incongruous, ridiculous, a peacock among pigeons, but he had the weight of empire behind him, and they knew it. Walter lowered his iron bar. Ida, her face twisted with disappointment, opened her mouth to speak, but Grove silenced her with a single raised finger. "Madam," he said, "I have heard quite enough of your voice for one evening. I have been standing in that alley for 10 minutes, and I have heard everything. Everything. You have incited a riot. You have trespassed. You have destroyed property. You have committed, unless I am very much mistaken, at least 4 felonies and a dozen misdemeanours. If I choose to testify, you will not see the outside of Strangeway's gaol for a very long time." The mob began to dissolve. Men edged toward the broken gate, their weapons suddenly heavy and incriminating in their hands. The women slipped away into the darkness, their stones dropped in the mud. Walter Tibbet, his face a sullen mask of shame and fear, followed them. Within minutes, the garden was empty, except for the 3 of them. Alice stood in the doorway of her ruined kitchen, the copper pot cradled against her chest. Grove stood among the trampled ruins of the dead rose bushes, his brogues caked in mud, his expression unreadable. Ida Fletcher stood alone at the gate, her mouth working, her fingers twisting in her apron. She looked at Grove, she looked at Alice. She spat on the ground and walked away. Grove waited until her footsteps faded. Then he turned to Alice. His voice, when he spoke, was different. The clipped command was gone. In its place was something quieter, something almost gentle. "Mrs. Godwin," he said, "I am not here to rescue you. I am a businessman. I have spent 3 weeks in this abominable town, drinking undrinkable ale and sleeping on a mattress that appears to be stuffed with hedgehogs, because I cannot stop thinking about what I smelt on your doorstep. I know you have a file. I know you refused my sovereigns. I am now making you a different offer. I will take you to London tonight. I will pay for a room, a laboratory, protection. You will make the perfume. You will sell it through my house. You will be rich." He paused, leaning on his cane. "Or you can stay here and wait for them to come back, because they will. They smell money now, and they will not stop until they have torn it out of your hands." Alice looked at the garden. She looked at the trampled dirt, the shattered cold frame, the snapped rose canes, the ground that had been poisoned twice over, first by grief and now by greed. She reached into her pocket and felt the file, still warm against her hip. Then she spoke for the first time since the glass had shattered. "I will not go to London," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "But I will make you a bargain." She bent down, slowly, her swollen joints protesting, and scooped a handful of the trampled soil. She held it up. The dirt was mixed with fragments of dead root and green shoot, the remnants of the seedlings that had been crushed. "You will stage a test," she said. "Here, in this street, in front of everyone who came tonight. You will bring your experts, your journalists, your society noses. You will give them a drop of what I have made, and you will let them say what they smell. And when they speak, you will listen. And then I will decide whether to sell." She let the soil trickle through her fingers. "That is my price." Grove looked at her for a long moment. The candlelight from the broken window caught the planes of his face, the pale, calculating eyes, the small, precise mouth. He saw the old woman with her ruined garden and her unreadable face and her single phial of liquid that had stopped his heart on a muddy street, and he knew that he was not negotiating with a peasant. He was negotiating with a woman who had nothing to lose. "Very well," he said. "1 week. I shall make the arrangements." He turned to go, then paused. "Mrs. Godwin, what is it? What did you use?" Alice did not answer. She was already kneeling in the mud. her fingers sifting through the wreckage of her garden, searching for something that might still be alive. The night before the public gathering, Alice Godwin did not sleep. The moon, a thin and indifferent crescent, rose over the mill chimney and cast a grudging light through the cracked panes of her kitchen window, the one the mob had not managed to shatter. The broken glass from the front window had been swept into a neat pile against the wall. The shattered coal frame had been cleared. The trampled earth had been raked smooth with her own hands, the calloused palms pressing the soil flat as if closing a wound. Now, in the deep silence of the small hours, with the street outside as quiet as it ever got, which was not very, she lit the stove and set the copper alembic on its trivet, and began the work that had consumed 4 years of her life. The process was not magic. It was not alchemy in the queer, mystic sense that Ida Fletcher imagined. It was a craft, ancient and exacting. The same craft that had been practiced by women in the hills of Bulgaria and the valleys of Provence for centuries before men in laboratories had learned to synthesize their imitations. Alice had taught herself from the margins of her son's book, from trial and error, from the slow, painstaking accumulation of failures that had filled the cottage with strange, acrid smokes and brought the neighbours knocking. She knew now what she had not known in that first brutal winter. She knew that the petals must be picked at dawn, when the dew was still on them and the volatile oils were most concentrated. She knew that the water in the copper pot must be kept at a temperature just below boiling, a bare whisper of steam, because too much heat would shatter the fragile aromatic compounds and leave behind nothing but a sour, vegetal stink. She knew that the distillation must be repeated, the first yield poured back over fresh petals, the essence doubling and redoubling its potency with each pass, until a single drop contained the ghost of 100 blooms. The petals she used tonight were the last of her store. She had been hoarding them for months, dried and cured in the darkness of her pantry, wrapped in squares of muslin and tucked into the gap behind the chimney breast where the bricks were always warm. They were not handsome petals. They were the blackened, withered remnants of the moss roses that had died in the autumn after William's death, the buds that had blighted on the cane and never opened, the leaves that had curled and crisped at the edges. She had learned, through 1,000 small experiments, that these damaged specimens held something the healthy blooms did not. The book had called it a secondary metabolite, a stress compound, a chemical defence that the plant produced when it was wounded or starving or fighting for its life. Alice did not know the word metabolite. She only knew that the blighted petals, when heated gently, released a dense, golden oil that smelled of rain and old wood, and the faint, distant memory of roses, while the healthy petals gave off a thin, pleasant scent that faded in an hour. The garden had taught her something that no perfumer in grass had ever learned. Beauty was not in the perfect bloom. Beauty was in the bloom that had survived the frost. She worked through the hours before dawn with the slow, methodical precision of a woman who had been doing the same task for years and could now perform it in the dark. She ground the dried petals in a stone mortar, not to a powder but to a coarse meal, the fragments still holding their shape. She scattered them into the copper pot, added rainwater she had collected from the butt at the corner of the cottage, water that had run off the slate roof and carried a faint, mineral tang of the stone. She sealed the lid, checked the seal, adjusted the trivet so the flame licked the bottom of the pot with a gentle, even heat. Then she sat back in her hard wooden chair and waited. The waiting was the hardest part. It always had been. The minutes stretched like hours in the dim kitchen, the only light coming from the blue flame of the stove and the faint glow of the candle on the mantelpiece. Alice's mind, left idle, drifted to places she had learned to avoid. It drifted to the morning of the accident, the sound of the knock on the door, the weight of her son's cooling cheek against her palm. It drifted to the funeral, a mean, hurried affair in the pauper's corner of the churchyard, the vicar mumbling the words as if he had somewhere better to be. It drifted to the garden, the first blackened rose, the way the hollyhocks had dropped their petals one by one like tears. She had spent 4 years refusing to think about these things, and now, on the night before she would be forced to defend her work before the entire street, she let the thoughts come. She let them wash over her and pass. She was too tired to fight them any more. The first drops of distillate began to fall at 3:30 in the morning. They emerged from the spout of the alembic in a thin, hesitant trickle, a liquid the colour of pale straw, and they fell into the glass phial that Alice had placed beneath the spout. The scent that rose from the phial was not the scent of flowers. It was the scent of wet earth after a long drought, the scent of old wood and distant rain, the scent of the night air in the hour before dawn, when the world is holding its breath. It was the scent of William's coat, the one she had never washed, the one that still hung on a peg in his room upstairs. Alice leaned forward and inhaled, and for a single suspended moment, she was not in her ruined kitchen with its boarded windows and its trampled garden. She was standing in the doorway of the cottage on a summer evening, watching her son sit on his upturned bucket, watching him watch the white blooms of the moss rose glow in the dark. She caught herself, she straightened, she adjusted the flame. The distillation continued, the drops falling with a steady, rhythmic plink into the phial, and the level of the liquid rose by millimetres. By the time the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the cracked window, the phial was full. Alice removed it from beneath the spout, stoppered it with a cork, wrapped it in a clean handkerchief, and slipped it into the pocket of her gown. The copper pot was empty, its water spent, its petals reduced to a brown, exhausted sludge. She would not make another batch. She had enough. She sat at the kitchen table as the dawn brightened, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the boarded window. She could hear the street waking up outside. She could hear the clatter of cart wheels on the cobbles, the cry of a milkman, the distant percussive throb of the mill engine starting its day. She could hear, beneath all of it, the murmur of voices, a low, expectant hum that grew louder as the hour approached. Phineas Grove had kept his word. He had spent the week making arrangements, sending telegrams to London, summoning journalists and scent merchants, and a single, very important nose from the house of a Parisian perfumer, whose name he had not disclosed. The public test was to be held at noon in the alley behind the cottage, the very spot where the mob had trampled the garden. Grove had insisted on the location. He was a showman at heart, Alice realised, a man who understood the power of a stage. He had even paid a carpenter to erect a small wooden platform over the ruined cold frame, a stage on which the drama would unfold. Alice did not care about the stage. She cared about the phial in her pocket and the truth it contained. She had agreed to the test for a single reason. She wanted Ida Fletcher to smell it. She wanted the whole street to smell it. All the men and women who had thrown stones and called her a witch and whispered that she had boiled her son's bones. She wanted them to inhale the essence of her withered garden and understand, in whatever dim, grudging way their minds could manage, what they had tried to destroy. The morning passed with the slow, grinding inevitability of a mill wheel. Alice did not eat. She did not drink. She sat at her table, her hands resting on the worn wood, her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and she waited. At 1:45 she rose. She smoothed her gown, adjusted her collar, pinned a stray lock of hair behind her ear. She took the phial from her pocket, unwrapped it from its handkerchief, and held it up to the light. The liquid was the colour of weak tea, pale amber, clear as glass. It gave off no scent while stoppered, but she knew what it held. She had distilled the ghost of a good thing, and soon the street would know it too. She stepped out of her cottage and into the alley, and the crowd that had gathered fell silent. There were more of them now than there had been on the night of the riot. The entire street had turned out, and others from the neighbouring lanes and courts, drawn by the rumour of a spectacle. They lined the alley in a dense, murmuring throng, their faces a mosaic of curiosity and suspicion and hunger. At the front, standing with her arms folded and her jaw set, was Ida Fletcher. Beside her, sweating in his Sunday collar, was the vicar she had dragged along to witness the proceedings. Phineas Grove stood on the wooden platform, dressed in a suit of pale grey linen, his silver-topped cane resting against his leg. Beside him stood a thin, severe-looking man in a black frock coat, the journalist from the London paper, and a small, round man with a bald head and a nose like a hawk's beak, the scent merchant from Paris. They had come a long way to smell a dead woman's flowers. Grove raised a hand, and the crowd fell silent. He cleared his throat. His voice, when he spoke, carried to the furthest corners of the alley, pitched to reach the back rows of a theatre. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you have heard stories. You have heard of a strange scent, a phantom perfume, a smell that conjures memories and troubles the sleep of honest folk. You have heard accusations. You have heard defences. I am not here to judge. I am here to conduct a test." He beckoned to Alice. She walked forward through the crowd, the phial in her hand, and the people parted before her as if she carried a live coal. She mounted the platform and stood beside Grove, her face expressionless. The scent merchant leaned forward, his hawk's nose twitching. The journalist produced a notebook and a stub of pencil. Alice unstoppered the file. The confession spilled from Ida Fletcher before anyone could stop it. The scent had hit her last, Grove, with the theatrical instinct of a man who understood timing as well as he understood top notes, had saved her for the finale. He had passed the handkerchief to the vicar, who had inhaled and gone pale and muttered something about the Gardens of Eden. He had passed it to the journalist, who had dropped his pencil and stared at the file as if it contained a controlled substance. He had passed it to the scent merchant from Paris, who had taken one sniff and begun to weep without shame, fat tears rolling down his round cheeks and into his collar. The crowd had watched all of this with a growing, uneasy silence, their scepticism eroding with every grown man reduced to blubbering. Then Grove had turned to Ida, standing at the front of the crowd with her arms still folded and her jaw still set, and he had held out the handkerchief. She did not want to take it. Every muscle in her body screamed against it. But the crowd was watching. The vicar was watching. The London journalist was watching, his pencil retrieved and poised above his notebook. To refuse would be to admit she was afraid, and Ida Fletcher was not a woman who admitted fear. She snatched the handkerchief from Grove's hand and pressed it to her face with a defiant, angry inhalation. The sound she made was not a scream. It was a sound that came from a place deeper than the throat, a raw, involuntary cry that was half a sob and half a name. The handkerchief fell from her fingers. Her knees buckled, and she sat down hard on the cobblestones, her skirts pooling around her in the mud, her face a mask of naked, unguarded shock. She was no longer in the alley. She was in a room she had not seen for 30 years, a cold, damp room above a chandler's shop in Oldham, and she was holding a bundle of clean wool, a baby's gown she had knitted herself in the last weeks of her pregnancy, the wool still carrying the faint animal scent of the sheep, and the baby she had left on the steps of the workhouse because she had no milk and no money and no husband and no hope, was wrapped in that gown, and she could smell it. She could smell the wool and the milk and the soft, powdery warmth of the child's skin. She had never spoken of that baby. Not to her husband, not to her neighbours, not to the vicar, not to God. She had buried the memory so deep that she had convinced herself it had never happened. But the scent had dug it up, had reached into the wet, dark soil of her soul and pulled out the one root she had spent a lifetime trying to kill. She sat on the cobblestones, her mouth opening and closing, her eyes streaming, and the crowd stared at her in a silence that was worse than any jeering. Alice watched from the platform. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She looked at Ida Fletcher with an expression that no one in the crowd could read, an expression that was neither pity nor satisfaction nor forgiveness, but something older and stranger, something that recognised a grief that had been buried alive. She stepped down from the platform, her worn boots crunching on the broken glass that still littered the alley, and she knelt beside her enemy. She picked up the handkerchief, still damp with the perfume, and she folded it and pressed it back into Ida's hand. The gesture broke something in the crowd. A murmur rippled through them, low and uneasy. They had come for a witch trial. They had come to see a woman exposed and punished. Instead, they had seen the town's chief accuser undone by a single breath, and they had seen the accused woman kneel in the mud to comfort her tormentor. It was not the story they had been told. It was not the story they had wanted. Ida raised her head. Her face was blotched and swollen, her eyes red-rimmed, her mouth trembling. She looked at Alice, and for a long moment, the two women simply stared at each other. Then Ida spoke, her voice a raw, scraped whisper that carried farther than any shout. "I lied," she said. "I lied about everything. There was no grave dirt. There were no bones. I wanted the gold. I wanted what she had, and I could not bear that she had it and I did not." She turned to the crowd, her voice rising to a cracked, desperate pitch. "I started the rumours. I threw the first stone. I brought you all here because I wanted to tear her down, and I used you, every one of you, to do it." The silence that followed was a living thing. Walter Tibbet, standing at the back of the crowd with his iron bar still clutched in his hand, let the weapon fall to the cobblestones with a clang that echoed off the alley walls. Joe Harling, the carter who had swung his pick handle at the coldframe, removed his cap and held it against his chest like a man in church. The women who had thrown stones looked at their feet. The vicar, his face a study in confusion and dawning shame, closed his prayer book and tucked it under his arm. One by one, the faces in the crowd shifted from accusation to something softer, something that looked almost like grief. Phineas Grove seized the moment with the instinct of a man who had spent his career in negotiation. He stepped to the front of the platform, his pale grey suit immaculate despite the mud, his silver-topped cane tapping once for attention. "I believe," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "that we have just witnessed a confession, a public confession, made in front of a representative of the press and a respected man of the cloth. I trust there will be no further accusations of witchcraft or grave robbing or any other such nonsense." He turned to the journalist, who was scribbling furiously in his notebook. "You will record, sir, that the perfume produced by Mrs. Alice Godwin is a legitimate botanical extraction derived from the roses of her own garden, and that its effects, while extraordinary, are entirely natural." The journalist nodded, his pencil flying. The scent merchant from Paris, still dabbing at his eyes with a silk handkerchief, stepped forward and began to speak in rapid, accented English. He had never, he said, encountered an absolute of such complexity. The sillage alone was worth a fortune. The fixative properties, the way the scent clung to the linen and refused to fade, were unlike anything he had tested in 30 years of buying. He offered, on behalf of his house, a contract, a fair price, a guaranteed purchase of every phial Alice could produce for the next 5 years. Grove raised a hand. "That offer," he said, "is contingent upon Mrs. Godwin's acceptance, and Mrs. Godwin has already made her position clear to me in private. She will not leave this town. She will not work in a factory. She will make her perfume in her own kitchen, at her own pace, and she will sell it to whom she chooses." He turned to Alice, his pale eyes meeting hers. "I have, however, persuaded her to accept a small, fair salary in exchange for the rights to her name on the bottle. Godwin's Lancashire Essence. It has a ring, I think." Alice did not answer immediately. She was still kneeling in the mud, her hand on Ida Fletcher's shoulder. She looked at the crowd, at the faces of the men and women who had thrown stones at her windows and trampled her garden, and she saw that something had shifted in them. They were no longer looking at her with suspicion. They were looking at her with a kind of wary, grudging wonder. The look of people who had just discovered that the woman they had dismissed as a witch was, in fact, something far stranger. An artist, a craftswoman, a maker of things that could not be explained and did not need to be. She rose to her feet. Her knees ached, her back ached. Her hands, those bark-like hands that had pulled nettles and pruned roses, and tended the copper pot through 4 years of failure, were trembling with exhaustion. But her voice, when she spoke, was steady. "I will take the salary," she said, "but I have conditions." The crowd leaned in. Grove raised an eyebrow. "The first condition," Alice said, "is that the money is used to repair what was broken. The fence, the cold frame, the windows." She looked at Walter Tibbet, who flinched. "The men who broke them will do the work. I will pay for the materials. They will pay with their labour." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Walter Tibbet opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. He had no ground to stand on. He had been seen. He had been marked. The alternative was the constable and a cell at Strangeways. "The second condition," Alice continued, "is that I teach what I know, not to everyone, to a few. Young women who have no trade and no prospects. I will teach them to grow and to harvest and to distill. I will not take apprentices, I will take students. They will learn, and they will go, and they will start their own gardens somewhere else." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "This is not a secret to be hoarded. It is a craft to be passed on. My son taught me that." The mention of William's name fell into the silence like a stone into still water. The older neighbours, the ones who remembered the quiet, awkward boy with his wildflowers and his moss roses, bowed their heads. The vicar cleared his throat and looked at the sky. Ida Fletcher, still sitting on the cobblestones, let out a low, broken sob. "The third condition," Alice said, and now her voice dropped to something quieter, something almost private, "is that Ida Fletcher is left alone. She has confessed. She has been punished enough, by her own conscience and by the truth she has just learnt about herself. No one is to harass her. No one is to throw stones at her door. She will live with what she has done, and that is punishment enough for any woman." Ida raised her head. Her face was a wreckage of tears and mud and disbelief. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Alice met her gaze for a long, steady moment, and something passed between the two women, a current of understanding that was too deep for words. They were both mothers who had lost children, one to the mill and one to the workhouse. They were both survivors of a world that chewed up women and spat them out. They were enemies by circumstance, but they were sisters in grief, and Alice, in her implacable, exhausted mercy, had chosen to break the chain. Grove, sensing that the business was concluded, tapped his cane on the platform. "The conditions are accepted," he said. "I shall draw up the papers myself. Now, if there are no further accusations, I suggest we adjourn to the Black Bull, where I am told the ale is undrinkable, but the company will be excellent." He offered his arm to Alice. She did not take it. She walked back to her cottage alone, her worn boots leaving prints in the mud, her file safe in her pocket, her head held high. The crowd dispersed slowly, in knots of twos and threes, their voices low and thoughtful. The journalist packed up his notebook and headed for the telegraph office. The scent merchant pocketed the handkerchief that Alice had given him, a souvenir of the strangest negotiation of his career. Ida Fletcher was helped to her feet by the vicar and led away, still weeping, still clutching the folded handkerchief against her chest like a relic. The alley emptied. The broken glass glittered in the thin afternoon light, and Alice Godwin, alone in her kitchen, set the copper pot back on the stove and began to plan. The garden, in the weeks that followed, did not return to what it had been. It could not. The dead rose canes, the ones that had survived the trampling, were too old and too damaged to bloom again. But Alice did not pull them out. She left them standing, their blackened, twisted forms a monument to what had been lost. Around them, in the soil that had been raked and fed and watered with the help of the very hands that had destroyed it, she planted new things. Neighbours she had never spoken to before appeared at her gate with offerings. Elsie Patchett, the loom worker who had smelled her lost sweetheart on the night of the riot, brought a cutting from her own grandmother's lavender, a variety so old that no one knew its name. Joe Harling, shamefaced and mumbling, delivered a cartload of well-rotted manure from his brother's farm, the best fertiliser in the county. The widow Tibbet, who had sent her son to break Alice's fence, arrived with a tin of seeds and a mumbled apology that Alice accepted without comment. Even Walter Tibbet came, his iron bar replaced by a spade, and spent 3 Saturdays turning the compacted earth until it was loose and dark and ready for planting. Young women came too. They came from the mill and the laundry and the sculleries of the big houses on the hill, girls with chapped hands and tired eyes and a hunger for something more than a life of drudgery. Alice taught them in the garden, her hands guiding theirs as they learned to feel the weight of a petal, the moisture in the soil, the exact moment when a bloom was ready to be picked. She taught them to read the signs of stress in a plant, the curling leaf, the yellowing stem, the subtle shift in scent that meant the oils were concentrating. She taught them to distill, the slow, patient craft of the copper pot, the way the steam carried the volatile souls of the flowers and condensed them into liquid memory. She did not charge them. She did not preach. She simply showed them what she knew, and they learned, and they went, and some of them wrote back, years later, to say that they had started their own gardens, their own stills, their own small businesses in towns Alice had never seen. The perfume, Godwin's Lancashire essence, did not make her rich. It made her comfortable, which was more than she had ever expected. Grove sold it in London and Paris and eventually New York, where the society ladies paid absurd sums for a phial that promised to smell like their own lost summers. The scent merchant's house produced it in small batches, each bottle numbered and signed, and the demand always outstripped the supply. Alice did not increase production. She made as much as her garden could give, and no more. The withered rose canes, the ones that had survived the blight and the trampling, continued to produce their strange, stressed petals, and those petals, rendered down in the copper pot, continued to yield an oil that no healthy bloom could match. The garden was not beautiful in the conventional sense. It was a patchwork of dead and living things, blackened canes and tender green shoots, a landscape of survival rather than perfection. But it was hers, and it was William's, and it was enough. On the day she turned 65, Alice woke before dawn, as she always did, and walked out into the garden in the grey, misty light. The moss rose, the original cutting that William had planted in the summer of 1901, had put out a single new shoot. It was thin and pale, barely the thickness of a pencil, but it was alive. It had survived the blight and the frost and the trampling and the neglect, and it was reaching, with the blind, stubborn optimism of all living things, toward the light. Alice knelt in the damp soil, her swollen fingers brushing the new leaves, and she thought of her son. She thought of his quiet voice, his dirty hands, his habit of walking the long way home to pick wildflowers from the verge. She thought of the book on apothecary arts and the smudged pencil note, and the phrase he had written, the phrase that had guided her through 4 years of darkness. Catching the ghost of a good thing. She had caught it. She had bottled it. And now, in the grey dawn light, with the mill chimney smoking on the horizon and the street waking slowly around her, she let herself feel something she had not felt since the day they carried William home on a plank. She let herself feel, not happiness, not contentment, but a quiet, settled peace. The peace of a woman who had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turned it, by slow, patient, stubborn degrees, into something that healed. The sun rose over the rooftops. The new leaves of the moss rose glittered with dew, and Alice Godwin, her hands in the soil, her heart at rest, began to plan the next planting.